In the year 1326, the most powerful man in the Western world issued a formal document, not a military order, not a territorial claim, not a theological statement about salvation or scripture, a law against rings and mirrors and phials and images. Pope John XXII, the papal bull Super Illius Specula, published from Avignon on the 27th of March in the year of our Lord 1326. The exact language is worth reading carefully. The bull declared automatic excommunication, no trial, no process, no opportunity to defend yourself, upon any Christian who used rings, mirrors, phials, or images to communicate with spirits, bind spirits, or compel spirits to act. You did not need to be convicted. The act itself was the sentence. Now ask yourself this. The institution that commanded the allegiance of every Christian in Europe, the institution with its own army, its own courts, its own legal codes, its own prisons, was frightened enough of rings and mirrors to issue a document saying, anyone who uses one is automatically cut off from God. No trial, no appeal, no mercy. What exactly were they so afraid of? I want to be precise about what I am saying tonight. I am not making a general argument that the Church suppressed ancient wisdom. That is too easy, too vague, too much of a grievance narrative without evidence. What I am saying is this. In the year 1326, a specific pope named John XXII wrote a specific law with specific language that mirrors, with extraordinary precision, the specific tools described in two specific manuscripts, the Key of Solomon and the Testament of Solomon. Rings, mirrors, phials, images. Those are not random categories. Those are the precise instruments of Solomonic practice as it had been transmitted for more than 1,000 years. He was not writing a general condemnation of magic. He was writing a targeted legal strike at Solomon's technology. And the question I have never been able to fully set aside, the question I want to trace through tonight, is why? What was actually at stake? What did the seals of Solomon actually do in the hands of ordinary people that made the most powerful institution in the Western world spend 700 years trying to make them disappear? Let me go back to the beginning. Not the beginning the Church would prefer. The medieval grimoires, the Renaissance occultists, the romantic revival of the 19th century. The actual beginning. The first century of the Common Era. A text called the Testament of Solomon. It was never canonized. It was never included in any official scriptural tradition. And yet it is one of the oldest continuous demonological texts in existence, and it preserves something that I have spent more than 3 decades trying to fully understand. In the opening chapter, Solomon receives a ring, not from a court jeweler, not from a treasury, from the archangel Michael. The ring bears a seal, a specific geometrical symbol, described across various manuscript traditions as a pentalpha, a 5-pointed star with specific names inscribed within each of its triangular sections. Michael's instruction to Solomon is precise. He said, use this seal, stamp it upon any demon you encounter. The seal will bind it. The demon cannot escape. And Solomon does. He stamps the seal upon a demon named Ornias, the same demon who had been stealing the vitality of a young boy working on the temple construction, appearing at sunset in human form, draining the boy nightly while remaining invisible to everyone else. The seal is stamped. Ornias is bound instantly. He cannot move, he cannot resist, he cannot escape. Solomon interrogates him, forces him to reveal his name, his function, his mechanism of harm, then commands him, bring Beelzebul. Ornias brings Beelzebul, king of the demons. Beelzebul is also stamped with the seal. He is also bound. And so it continues, through the 36 demons catalogued in chapter 18, each named, each described in terms of the specific ailment it causes, and each given a counterseal, a specific symbol that neutralizes its particular function. This is not demonology as decoration. This is a medical taxonomy. 36 demons, 36 ailments, 36 counterformulas. The structure is precise, methodical, empirical in its orientation, even if its content is supernatural. Each demon causes a specific harm. Each harm has a specific counterseal. You do not ward off demons in general with the Testament of Solomon. You identify which demon is operating, because you know what ailment it causes, and you apply the specific counter-seal that neutralizes that specific demon. That is not superstition. That is targeted intervention. Now here is the thing about those 36 demons that I need you to hold in your mind. They are not original to Solomon. They are older by at least 1,000 years. Pablo Torrijano, in his scholarly study Solomon the Esoteric King, published by Brill Academic in 2002, traced them directly to the 36 deacons of Hellenistic Egyptian astrology. The 10-degree divisions of the zodiac used by Egyptian priests from at least the 21st century BCE. Each deacon was associated with a presiding spirit, a specific disease it caused, and a protective astronomical symbol. The ailments match, the cosmic associations match, the protective symbols, and which became the counter-seals, match. What Solomon received was not invented from nothing. It was a tradition of enormous antiquity, encoded in Egyptian astronomical science, passed through Jewish mystical practice, transmitted forward across 1,000 more years to the medieval grimoires. When the church burned manuscripts containing the seals of Solomon, they were burning something that, at its deepest archaeological layer, was a star chart, and the church burned it. I was 29 years old. I was finishing my doctorate at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. I had been living in Bloomsbury for 4 years by that point, in a flat above a used bookshop on a street close enough to the British Museum that I could walk there in 7 minutes. I was not researching Solomonic magic. I was writing a chapter on the transmission of 15th century Italian scribal manuscripts. The question I was investigating was purely technical. How had certain texts been copied? By whom? And what could the handwriting tell us about the networks through which ancient knowledge had traveled through medieval Europe? I submitted a reading request for Harley MS 5596. The request was approved. The librarian brought it from the archive. I set it on the reading room desk and opened it. I had been expecting a collection of religious or administrative texts. What I was looking at was the Key of Solomon, in Latin, 15th century Italian scribal hand, beautifully preserved, the ink still dark, the parchment intact, the diagrams, including the seals themselves, drawn with mathematical precision, still sharp after 500 years. I photographed the page layouts for my paleographic analysis. I went home. That evening I was preparing for a seminar on Talmudic narrative. The assigned reading included Tractate Gittin, pages 68a and 68b, the Asmodeus passage. I had read it before. Every scholar who has worked in this field has read it, but that evening, after spending the afternoon with the Harley manuscript, I read it differently. Tractate Gittin, 68a. Solomon needed to build the temple. The problem was this. 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 7 states explicitly that the temple was to be built without iron tools. When it was built, only finished stones cut at the quarry were used, and no hammer, chisel, or any other iron tool was heard at the temple site while it was being built. No iron, but stone must be cut. And to cut stone without iron, without metal tools of any kind, requires something that should not exist. The rabbis called it the shamir, a worm, or possibly a creature of some other kind, and the texts are imprecise and scholars have debated it across centuries. But the function is clear. The shamir could cut stone without iron tools. It was the solution to the temple's foundational requirement. The problem was that Solomon did not have it. The shamir was in the possession of the king of demons, Asmodeus. Solomon used his seal ring to capture Asmodeus. This is not a marginal account. This is the Babylonian Talmud, one of the most authoritative texts in the entire Jewish tradition, compiled across centuries by the greatest legal and theological minds in history. Solomon captured the king of demons, bound him with the seal, and demanded the shamir. Asmodeus provided it. And then, this is the part that stopped me cold that evening, Asmodeus was put to work on the temple itself. The demon that Solomon had captured and bound, the king of the demons, the 32nd spirit in the hierarchy that the Ars Goetia would later catalogue, participated in the construction of the Temple of Jerusalem, the holiest building in the history of monotheism, the house of God, built in part by a demon, bound by Solomon's seal. I sat in my flat in Bloomsbury. I had the photograph of the Harley manuscript on my desk. I had the Gittin passage open in front of me. I wrote in my notebook very slowly, "The grimoire and the Talmud are describing the same event." And then I wrote a second line. "The church condemned the seals as demonic. The Talmud says the seals built the temple." I did not sleep well that night, not because I was frightened, because I understood for the first time what was actually at stake in John XXII's bull of 1326. It was not just theology. It was not just power. It was the single most explosive irony in the entire history of Western religion. The institution that condemned Solomonic seals as demonic practice was heir to a tradition built by the very power those seals controlled. Let me show you the eyewitness account, because the seals of Solomon were not theoretical in the 1st century after Christ. They were operational. Josephus, Flavius Josephus, Jewish historian of the 1st century CE, author of Antiquities of the Jews, a man writing for a Roman audience, trained in the conventions of Roman historiography, acutely aware that his reputation rested on the credibility of what he reported. He is not a man you would expect to describe a demon exorcism. In Antiquities of the Jews, Book 8, he does exactly that. He describes witnessing personally, in the presence of the Emperor Vespasian, in front of a gathering of soldiers and bystanders. A Jewish healer named Eleazar used a specific method to cast a demon from a man. The method had two components: a root held beneath the man's nostrils, and a ring bearing a seal. And here Josephus uses language that makes the source of the seal unmistakable. A seal mentioned by Solomon. Josephus was not a believer in magic. He was a historian writing for the most skeptical possible audience. He described what he saw: a ring, a seal, a specific methodology transmitted from Solomon, a demon cast from a man in front of an emperor. The seal was not a symbol. It was not a spiritual metaphor. It was a functional technology that a 1st century healer used in public, before witnesses, before the ruler of the known world. And it worked, at least according to the historian who was standing there watching it. This is the oldest non-mystical eyewitness account of a Solomonic seal in operation. Not in a grimoire, not in a mystical text, in a historical chronicle written for Romans by a man whose professional reputation depended on what he reported. Now I want to show you the structure of the seals themselves. Because the church did not destroy them because they were nonsense. The church destroyed them because of what they implied about power. The 72 spirits of the Ars Goetia, the most famous of the Solomonic spirit catalogues, are not an arbitrary number. 72 is not random. In Exodus chapters 14 through 19, there is a passage describing the crossing of the Red Sea. Verses 19, 20, and 21 of chapter 14 describe the movement of the angel of God, the pillar of cloud, and the waters themselves. In the original Hebrew, each of those 3 verses contains exactly 72 letters, exactly 72, not approximately, not in most manuscripts. In the Hebrew text, as it has been transmitted since antiquity, the Kabbalistic tradition developed what is called the Shem HaMepharash, the divided name, or the 72-fold name of God. By reading the 3 verses in a specific pattern, the first verse left to right, the second verse right to left, the third verse left to right, taking the letters vertically down the columns, you produce 72 3-letter combinations, 72 names of God. The same power that Moses used to part the Red Sea, according to the Kabbalistic understanding, was encoded in those 3 verses as 72 divine names. Now here is what made me set down my notebook and walk around my flat 3 times before I could sit still again. The 72 demons of the Ars Goetia are not random spirits. They are the shadow mirror of the 72 names. Each of the 72 Goetic spirits has a corresponding angel that can bind it. The structure of the Goetia implies, for anyone who knows the Kabbalistic tradition, that each demon is the dark inversion of one of the 72 names of God. The seals of Solomon were not arbitrary symbols. They were the inverted names of God, encoded as geometric sigils, used to command the very spirits that were the shadows of divine authority. Think about what that means. To use a seal of Solomon was not to practice magic in the sense of invoking unknown forces. It was to apply a specific name of God in its inverted binding form, to the specific demonic force that was that name's shadow. It was applied divine authority, not mediated through a priest, not requiring institutional permission, not filtered through any hierarchical structure. Anyone who possessed the knowledge of the correct seal could access the corresponding divine authority directly. They could bind what the name of God said could be bound. They could compel what divine authority said could be compelled. Without a priest, without a sacrament, without the church. Now do you understand why John XXII issued his bull? Islamic tradition understood this before the church did. The Quran records Solomon, in Surah An-Naml, chapter 27, verse 17. And gathered for Solomon were his soldiers of the jinn and men and birds, and they were arranged in rows. The jinn, the spirits, were his soldiers, his army. By what authority? Islamic tradition holds that the seal ring, the Khatam Sulayman, was given by the angel Gabriel. It was made of two components, brass to command benevolent spirits, and iron to command malevolent ones, two separate seals, one ring. The theological point that Islamic scholars preserved is precise and devastating. When Saka the demon stole the ring from Solomon while Solomon bathed, this account appears in various forms across Islamic tradition, Solomon temporarily lost his kingdom. Not because the ring was a magic charm that gave Solomon personal power, but because the ring was a delegation of divine authority granted by God through Gabriel, encoded in the seal. Without the seal, Solomon was just a man. With the seal, Solomon held delegated divine authority over spiritual forces. That distinction is the heart of what the church could not allow, because if the seal was a delegation of divine authority, not Solomon's personal power, but God's authority passed through a symbolic medium, then anyone who received the same knowledge could receive the same delegation. The seal was not a crown. It was not limited by succession. It was a technology, and technology can be transmitted to anyone, at any time, without institutional gatekeeping. That is what 700 years of systematic destruction was actually about. Let me be precise about what John XXII believed, because this is the detail that removes any doubt about the nature of the campaign. The year is 1326. John XXII publishes Super Illius Specula, condemning the use of rings, mirrors, phials, and images as demonic communication, on pain of automatic excommunication. The same year, members of his own court were accused of using wax images and lead figurines to curse him. The same pope who issued the bull against magical images believed that magical images were being used against him. He was not prosecuting something he considered fraudulent. He was prosecuting something he personally feared was real. He destroyed what he was afraid of. He closed the door, or tried to, on a technology that he believed worked, because he believed someone was using it on him. That is not theological zealotry. That is a power calculation made by a frightened man, and a frightened man destroys what frightens him. The seals of Solomon were not condemned because they were ineffective. They were condemned because they were the opposite. The destruction was enormous. The Lateran councils of the 12th century had already begun restricting Solomonic texts. The Synod of Paris in 1210, inquisitors across France, Italy, Spain, and Germany burning specific manuscripts when found. Scribes who copied the Key of Solomon faced excommunication. Practitioners who used Solomonic methodology, rings, sealed objects, spoken formulas against specific demons, faced heresy statutes that carried penalties up to and including execution. 700 years. That is not the reaction of an institution that considered the seals a harmless superstition. That is the sustained, organized, legally enforced effort of an institution that considered the seals a direct threat to its authority. Because they were. A technology that gave individuals direct access to divine authority over spiritual forces without priestly mediation, without institutional permission, was not merely theologically inconvenient. It was an existential challenge to the entire edifice of hierarchical religious authority. The Church did not destroy the seals because they did not work. The Church destroyed the seals because they worked too well and too independently. Here is where the irony becomes almost impossible to absorb. The Vatican Library, the archive of the same institution that issued the Bull of 1326, that burned manuscripts across 7 centuries, that prosecuted practitioners under heresy statutes, holds in its own collection manuscript copies of the very texts it publicly condemned. Not one copy, multiple copies. The Key of Solomon, the Lesser Key of Solomon, Solomonic seals and sigils in various manuscript traditions, preserved, catalogued, protected. The British Library holds Harley MS 5596, the copy I was examining the afternoon before I read Gittin 68. The Bodleian Library at Oxford holds Aubrey MS 24. The same tradition that the Church's inquisitorial apparatus was burning in the hands of common practitioners was being preserved in the libraries of the Church's own theologians, and in the collections of European scholars who knew their value. The seals were not eliminated. They were concentrated, moved from the commons, from the hands of ordinary healers, ordinary practitioners, ordinary men and women who might use them for ordinary purposes, into the exclusive possession of institutions and individuals who understood their value precisely because they were forbidden. The Church destroyed the copies. It could not destroy what the copies described. And it knew that, which is why certain copies were never destroyed at all. Let me tell you what this means. For 2,000 years, a tradition existed that gave individuals, not priests, not scholars, not members of an institution, direct access to divine authority over spiritual forces. You did not need ordination. You did not need sacraments. You did not need permission from anyone. You needed the knowledge of the correct seal for the specific spirit you were dealing with. The Talmud's 36 deacon demons, each with their counter-formula. The Ars Goetia's 72 spirits, each with their seal and their angelic counterpart. The Islamic tradition's 2-component ring, brass and iron, each commanding a different order of being. A taxonomy, a catalogue, a technology, developed in Egypt, refined in Jerusalem, transmitted forward across 3,000 years despite everything that was done to stop it. The Ars Goetia is available in any bookshop. The Key of Solomon, in S.L. Mather's critical edition of 1888, is freely available in digital form. The Testament of Solomon has been published in the F.C. Conibert critical edition. Tractate Gittin is available in English translation. The primary texts were not destroyed, they survived. And so, whether you regard them as metaphor, as encoded psychological technology, or as something you are not yet sure how to categorize, the question the tradition presents remains the same. Why did the most powerful institution in Western history spend 700 years trying to make you forget them? You do not wage a systematic, sustained, legally enforced war against something that does not work. You wage it against something you are afraid of. And the Church was afraid. Automatic excommunication. No trial. The act is the sentence. That is not the response of an institution confident that the technology is fraudulent. And the seal was the authorization. And the authorization was inscribed with the name of God. That is what they destroyed. That is what they could not quite destroy. And that is what you are holding in your hands tonight, every time you open the texts that survived. I want to close with something that has stayed with me since that evening in Bloomsbury. The moment I set the Gittin passage down next to the photograph of the Harley manuscript and wrote those 2 lines in my notebook. The institution that condemned the seals did not condemn them because it considered them powerless. It condemned them because it understood correctly that they were powerful in a specific and dangerous way. Dangerous to any institution that needs to position itself between human beings and divine authority. Dangerous to any structure that depends on the belief that access to spiritual power requires institutional mediation. Dangerous to any system of authority that cannot survive the knowledge that ordinary people, with the right information, can do what the priests can do. The seals of Solomon were not a threat to God. They were a threat to the gatekeepers. And the gatekeepers did what gatekeepers do. They destroyed the key, except they did not destroy it completely, because some of them understood what the key was for. And they kept a copy. The manuscripts are in the British Library, reference Harley MS 5596. They are in the Bodleian, reference Aubrey MS 24. They are in the Vatican Library, where no one with the authority to destroy them has chosen to do so. They are in the Mather's edition of 1888, available in print and digitally. They are in the Conybeare edition of the Testament of Solomon, published in 1898. They are in Tractate Gittin, which has been available in English for more than a century. The seals were not erased. They were waiting for someone willing to read the right texts in the right order, to trace the lineage backward, from the medieval grimoires to the Testament of Solomon, to Josephus, to the Talmud, to the Egyptian deacons, and to understand what they were actually looking at. A technology of divine authority, 2,500 years old, still intact. The church destroyed the copies. They could not destroy what the copies described. What you do with that knowledge is, as always, entirely up to you. But you cannot say after tonight that you did not know it existed, or that it was ever truly gone. Sleep well tonight, or perhaps stay awake a little longer. The texts are there. They have been waiting a long time.